So enjoy part 2. Part 3 will be coming out later this week, and so that was a lie. Hello and welcome to History Check, the show where I end up falling off of release schedule due to having to re-record and re-edit half of an episode. Oh, and I also talk about the history of D&D classes and monsters, I guess. And in this episode, we're finishing up the meta-history of our folks and plate, Paladins, as we dive into what changes 4E and 5E did to them. So, just to get groundwork out of the way, the title gives away that this video is part 3. Part 1 and part 2 are in the button on the top right, and this opening is going to be a bit abrupt since part 3 was originally meant to be in part 2 before I realized how insanely long that was going to be. Growing pains, I guess. Everybody caught up? Foundation laid down? Cool. Let's talk 4E. 2008 saw the release of Dungeons & Dragons 4E, which over its existence has received, mixed opinions. But I don't really care about reviews. I care about Paladins, and, well, some things happened with Paladins in this edition, guys. The biggest change, whose repercussions reverberate through the rest of the class, is that Paladins are now intrinsically tied to religion, as they must choose a god upon creation, and are from there on out thematically tied not to a higher ideal, but to that god. Sure, some of 4E's ridiculous number of supplements and campaign settings would bring in things like the Cavalier, whose powers from their virtues and not gods, but the core Paladins in 4E are immediately tied to religion upon creation. These ties to religion also bring with them ties to new alignments. Paladins are no longer expected to be solely lawful good, but instead their alignment is to match that of their god, whether that be lawful good, chaotic good, unaligned, or even evil. Sure, the book states that the majority of Paladins are good, but it also directly references evil Paladins existing to serve dark gods. And this ability for evil Paladins means that they can't fall in 4E. The rulebook changes where their source of power comes from entirely, explicitly saying that their powers aren't technically granted by the gods, nor from their devotion. But instead, they are bestowed upon the Paladin by a series of rituals and rites that give them the ability to shoot divine power from their hands. This effectively means that Paladins must start similarly to their gods, but the only consequences for not following the will of their god or oaths is that they might be hunted down by other members of their order. I told you there was a lot different. 4E also saw the shift to the power system as opposed to the spell slot system or previous class features from before. Class features still exist, but they're a little bit more muted, and powers by and far replace class-specific spells. 4E's shift to the power system means that there is a lot, and I mean a lot when it comes to abilities. Lay on Hands is still present because it won't ever really go away with D&D Paladins, but a lot of their other innate abilities are either put into their powers or replaced by versions of Channel Divinity, a skill that grants the Paladin different powers based off of their chosen god. Paladins also gain a weird kind of taunt in 4th edition that they actually won't get back in almost any other edition. It's because they wanted Paladins to be tanks in 4th edition, it's just the way of things. It's not hugely important down the road, but I just wanted to bring it up so that people wouldn't accuse me of forgetting it. A lot of the Paladins' more traditional protective auras are scattered throughout the powers system, along with more forms of smite available to them than a preacher in 1692 Massachusetts. Really, there's just pages of different kinds of smite. I could dig through all these, but, well, we'd be here forever and nobody wants that. Instead, I want to talk about the inspiration for this seemingly drastic change in lore. Where did the idea of wildly holy paladins more willing to serve their gods than the good of the world come from? And I think the answer is obviously the Crusades. In my first video, I went over a brief tangent on the Crusades and the Crusaders, where I said that they were important for where Paladins would end up, but made a very big point of saying that they are not where Paladins originally came from or were inspired by. But while the Crusader orders will and have influenced the depiction of modern-day Paladins, they are not the start of that history. A part of it, definitely, but not the foundation of the whole story. I talked about Shantan de Roland as long as I did for a reason, and these guys just don't quite line up for the same reasons. And when I said that they would become a big part of what Paladins would become, this is what I meant. I feel like their influence is felt more in 4E than anywhere else. The Paladins of 4E, with their dedication to God over devotion, reads more to me as Crusaders, dedicated to Catholicism over all else. Crusaders were knights that took holy oaths, and may very well have believed that these oaths granted them divine powers. However, they were also highly trained warriors whose training would separate them from the common man. Once the Crusader ended their training, they could basically do anything they wanted with the skills that they had been trained with without a loss of those skills. Crusaders were beings dedicated to their god, oftentimes above all else, but they were also not people who would lose the ability to fight if they strayed from that god. Instead, they would just be hunted down by other members of their order. This change of influence is even all but pointed out within one of the Paladins' Paragon classes, with the Hospitaller being an obvious reference to the Knights Hospitaller of the Crusades, with Paladins of that path being better at healing and caring for others, almost like they're based off an organization that was known for setting up hospitals. None of this is to say that references to the original Paladins don't exist in 4E. The actual weapon Paragon path is clearly a reference to the Paladins' previous ties to holy weapons, as is the Champion of Order, a Paracon path dedicated to combat against chaos. And I've already mentioned the Cavaliers from Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdom, who gained their power by embodying certain virtues as opposed to divine rights. But these references are just those references. Almost like how anything that the previous editions talked about when it came to the Crusaders were also just references. There's this big split between reference and inspiration, and I feel like that's felt more here than anywhere else. In 3.5, Charlemagne's 12 Peers and Holger Karlsson were the inspiration for Paladins, with Crusaders being things referenced to fill out their sheets. Here, Crusaders are the inspiration for Paladins, with the 12 Peers being references to fill out their sheets. The difference is pretty stark and rather important, as it makes Paladins feel way more zealous here than they have in previous editions, where they potentially could have just been somebody that was so ridiculously good that they had holy powers. Speaking of reversals, it's time to talk about the darkly armored elephant in the room. 4E supplement Heroes of Shadow officially gives name, moves, and rules to the Blackguard, the edgiest of 4E's edgy boy paladins. Blackguard are effectively paladins who get their powers by embracing, channeling, and embodying dark vices. They're the exact opposite of the Cavaliers from Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdom. It's actually kind of ironic that in this way, Blackguard leans more towards Paladins in the Paladin versus Crusader paradigm than 4E's base class for Paladins, since Blackguard at least get their powers by some kind of determination or devotion to something, even if that something's not good. Also, before I continue on about Blackguards, I want to point out that the book actually says that Blackguard aren't always evil either. Heroes of Shadows explicitly state that there's Blackguard that will hold themselves to higher ideals. This means that in 4E, you can have evil-aligned paladins who serve dark gods and gain their powers through dark rituals, and good-aligned Blackguard who gain their powers through dark emotions but use it to fight the evil of these paladins. There's kind of an awesome poetry in that. But potentialities of goodness aside, Blackguard are clearly built as the antithesis of paladins. They're meant to be the anti-paladin, opposite of everything the divine warriors stand for, and historically, well, writers have always left twists on hero characters. From something as old as Mordred and Arthur to as recent as Dark Link and Link. It's a constant writing trope, and for good reason. A hero having to face the darkness in their heart is a compelling story beat. And it's with some of these ideals in mind that Blackguards were likely made. And that's the angle I want to take for their origins, for their history, and where they came from. And as much as I would love to play that angle for their character design and the appearances that they have in the rulebook, well, you see, Heroes of Shadow was released in 2011, with this as its cover, and this character also shows up multiple times, representing the Blackguard within the book. And this is an image of Arthas, a fallen paladin that served as the villain in the 2008 expansion to World of Warcraft named Wrath of the Lich King. There's a possibility there's another obvious source I'm missing, but for how close the art they chose to use to represent the Blackguard looks, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. 4E Paladins, save from the Cavalier and ironically the Blackguard, are the furthest I think that the Paladins of D&D ever get from 3 Hearts and 3 Lions and the 12 Peers of Charlemagne. I don't mean for that to be a condemnation either, before people get mad at me about it. It's just the truth. Things change as they iterate, and the Paladins are no different, but it's just amazing just how different they are in 4E compared to where they came from, and again, it's the difference between inspiration and reference. And whether or not 4E was well received doesn't matter as much as the fact that 4E Paladins have remained important in the mentality of players. See, the connection to religiousness and Paladins have always, again, existed in kind of an implied state, but 4E making it so outright explicit has actually kind of defined the Paladin as a holy warrior of the gods, even though in 5E things will change yet again as far as their powers are concerned. They became a very major stepping stone for what Paladins would become, and I've talked about 5e multiple times, but with 4e done, it's time for us to actually get there. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was released in 2014, and it's where everything we've talked about over the last 2 videos has been leading. 5th edition has been wildly successful over its release cycle, particularly thanks to things like Critical Role and other podcast-style shows using its rule sets as a basis. But its success isn't important here. You know it's important here by now. So, for Paladins, 5e does away with 4e's core religious requirements again, and replaces the Paladin's power source with a selection of oaths that may be to gods, but aren't required to be by the rulebook. Basically saying that the Paladin's belief in these oaths is so powerful that they get their strength from them, instead of necessarily through any gods. 4e's unlocked alignments make a bit of a muted return with the core rulebooks, not explicitly saying that Paladins can't be evil, but making it exceptionally clear that most of the time they won't be. In fact, almost all Paladins are good. Chaotic is still on the board, though, which is good, because more choices is always better. Further, 5E turns away from 4E's power system and brings back 3.5 spell slot and class feature system, with Paladins in particular being returned to mechanically a hybrid of fighters and clerics, with spell slots usable to cast holy spells, and weapon specialization that allows them to just smack somebody with whatever they want to smack them with. Smite returns as a class feature, more similar to 3.5 than the power-driven smites of 4th edition, with the Paladin being allowed to spend spell slots to use their smite. Lay on Hands is also here, because it's going to be. Paladins are once again baseline immune to disease. They get an aura of protection that boosts saving throws, and another aura that makes them and their friends immune to fear. It's really all here, including 5e bringing the Paladin-only Find Steed spell into existence, which allows them to summon magical mount friends that can be horses, war ponies, or whatever the DM will let you get away with. The previously mentioned oaths that power the Paladin are also available to serve as their subclass and change their features. Namely, 4E's Returning Child Channel Divinity no longer gains its specificities from gods, but rather from the oaths that the Paladin takes. While every Paladin oath gives slightly different spell slots and a bit of different class features, interesting things to note is that almost all of them give some form of the following. Turning spells akin to AD&D's Turn Undead, including a turning spell that allows them to turn Fey. Counterspell or some other anti-magic ability, likely a reference to Greyhawk or AD&D's Paladins being resistant or immune to magic. And protection from whatever spells, basically the Paladin's previous forms of damage reductions made specific to their oaths. And I could go on about all the other small facets of all the different oaths, but there's a lot of them, and they each have a lot of stuff to talk about, and I already did that in my original script, and it was a slog. So we're just going to go over the details of the oaths that I'm interested in, both historically and context-wise. Cool? Cool. Starting off is going to be the Oath of Devotion. It is the most paladin to paladin with all of the oaths, protecting order and good and basically blah 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 blah. Oath of Devotion paladins are paladins from 3.5 adapted into 5e. The main thing I want to focus on with them is that they have the ability to perform Channel Divinity to turn their weapon into a sacred weapon, giving them a type of holy weapon akin to the holy swords of earlier editions without the magic immunity. This is mostly interesting to me because it's a modern iteration of the divine weapons used in Paladin's earlier histories a la Greyhawk or AD&D, but as opposed to making it a massive quest that they have to partake, it makes the holy weapon an inherent part of the Paladin as a whole. It's not really big, but it's kind of a cool callback. The next oath I want to talk about is the Oath of the Ancients, and this is because they're just so incredibly weird. An Oath of the Ancients paladin is basically a paladin that's decided to take an oath saying that they'll protect nature and keep the light of hope alive in the world. They get a smattering of druid-like spells and a bunch of features that basically turns them into Treebeard wearing plate armor. The Oath of the Ancients paladins are so cool to me though, and I'm making a big deal out of them because they're sometimes known as Fey Knights and have a natural inclination towards fairy, the Fey, and elves. And this is after 3 Hearts and 3 Lions established so thoroughly that Paladins were on the opposite side of the Fey and Chaos. This is after AD&D spent 2 editions preventing elves from being Paladins because of the elven ties to the Fey. This is after all of that, and still, in 5e, we've arrived here with Fey Knights. Paladins that have natural ties to the wild, to Chaos, and to the Fey. And they can also be elves, just to really show how far we've come. In a few ways, Fey Knights are actually more antithetical to the idea of traditional paladins than Blackguard or the upcoming Oathbreakers, and I think that's amazing. Iteration upon iteration of lore and history has led ultimately here, to a complete inversion of the paladin's original ties to order and specifically humanity. Fey Knights allow the player to bring out a totally different side to paladins in general, and flavor them in completely different ways than would have become standard over the years. It gives the player more options to make things that they might not have had earlier, and honestly, I really dig that. More options for players is always good, so long as it fits within the narrative, and Fey Knights are consistent with the idea of what 5e brings forth with paladins, as warriors more in line with their oaths and ideals than necessarily with gods. And moving on along with that idea from Fey Knights, let's talk about the edgy boys and girls. The Oath of Vengeance and Oath of Conquest Paladins are 2 I want to bring up just because they're a bit more nuanced and interesting takes on paladins, with these 2 gaining their powers from their oaths to take revenge and to conquer, respectively. You'll notice these aren't particularly virtuous sources of power. I like the idea of Vengeance and Conquest Paladins, though, if for no other reason than it does bring up the neutrality of paladins to some degree, and the idea that not all oaths are necessarily to something higher or positive. They can be, certainly, but, well, Conquest Paladins are outright said in the rulebook to be commonly drawn to the darkness, and sometimes they're given the nickname Hell Knights, so they're not always good. And I do like both of these concepts, as they bring out options for players, whilst also giving Paladins a darker side that players can play with, even if they don't necessarily intend to go full evil. However, if they do choose to go full evil, it does actually permit them and sticks them with the consistent theme of the Paladins' convictions being the source of their powers, not necessarily their goodliness or godliness. And even if those convictions aren't necessarily good, those powers can still be there with the Paladin. And overall, considering how positive I've been about all the options and flavor changes presented by Ancients, Vengeance, and Conquest Paladins, then I think my opinions on Oathbreakers are probably going to be a bit obvious. Oathbreaker Paladins are a subclass found only in the DM's guide and are described as Paladins that have broken their oath to follow some evil power, quote-unquote. Oathbreakers are basically 5E's version of Blackguard, as evil Paladins of the world, and well, I don't know, honestly. I think they're a smidge less interesting than their predecessors. From my understanding, upon reading the Oathbreaker, they can only be evil, and they gain powers solely for use amongst the evil and the dark by being evil and dark. I've seen Oathbreakers used as the Paladin subclass for evil gods before, which I guess is a good way to make use of them, though I feel like the Oath of Vengeance and Conquest Paladins just as easily fulfill those roles. But the books definitely have some inconsistencies about their fates in the first place, which we'll get to. I bring Oathbreakers up mostly because A, it's another show of the storyteller's desire to twist the idea of the good and just into something dark and evil, a continuation on the background presented by the Blackguard, as I've said before, and B, because Oathbreakers are capable of atoning, something 4E Paladins couldn't do. But how they atone has some weird consequences on the rest of the rules. See, Oathbreakers are basically a mix of 4E's lack of the Paladin's ability to fall and 3.5 abilities for a Paladin to regain their powers. If a Paladin goes bad in 5E, they don't just become fighters, they become Oathbreakers. And through extreme work, they can take up another oath again and become full Paladins once more. It does bring the idea of a fallen Paladin that's reclaimed their power back into the light, but the atonement section brings up the Oathbreaker having to choose a deity to atone towards. And this seems to clash pretty hard with the rest of the rules presented within the 5E's Player's Handbook, because by the rules of 5E, Paladins don't necessarily get their powers from the gods in the first place. So why do they have to choose one if they wish to atone? Also, it seems pretty obvious that Oath of Conquest Paladins can work towards evil means, so Paladins can have powers from dark sources, so can an Oathbreaker atone towards an evil oath if they wish to pick one up? Also, the whole concept of an Oathbreaker atoning brings up some really weird questions about the source of the Paladin's powers in the first place. See, Oathbreakers still have Paladin-esque powers. Sure, they're dark and evil, but they're still Paladin powers. The rulebook says they're following some evil goal, which I guess can grant them powers, but well, if a Paladin's powers in 5E come from their oaths, but they still get the powers if they break their oaths, where do their powers come from? Some dark source, sure, I guess, rulebook, but what is that dark source and why are they still considered Paladins? And back to what I've talked about before, if a Paladin that wants to atone takes up a new oath, then why do they have to pick up a god with it? Because gods aren't necessarily in the oaths in the first place. It just doesn't make sense. If the Paladin's convictions and devotions are the source of their powers, they should lose those powers when the conviction is gone, and they definitely shouldn't have to pick up a god to pick that conviction back up. And also, my compliments on Vengeance, Conquest, and Ancients have all been about giving players more choices while sticking to the theme, and Oathbreaker's always evil requirements kind of does the opposite of that. And before someone brings up homebrew in the comments, I know you can homebrew things however you want. I get it. But this episode, and this show in general, is about what the rulebooks say about Paladins, not what the community comes up with. And the rulebooks aren't consistent. Also, I do know that I sound like I'm being sour on 5E, and I want to address that too, because it might come up in the future. I love 5E. It's brought in more players than any edition before it. It's spread the hobby and helped strengthen the overall interest, longevity, and diversity of the community. It's easy to pick up, it's fun to play. But you're allowed to criticize things you like, and in fact, you should, because it helps you have a more critical understanding of things in general. And also, I was pretty positive about the other weird things 5E did with Paladins. I'm just not fond of Oathbreakers, because, again, I don't feel like they fit the theme of 5E's Paladins, and I don't feel as if they give players enough choice on what they actually get to make. And this is all also coming off of the heels of Blackguard, which I thought were so much cooler. All of that aside, though, I think that is actually all the meta history of Paladins that I think I can legally cover in one video, and I say legally because it'd probably be against the Geneva Convention if I carried this on much longer. They're an interesting class with both a really long history and an intricate meta history that's definitely going to bring up a lot of arguments in my comments about their religiousness, both towards me and towards each other, and all I ask for you guys down there is to be nice, just be kind. I know there's a lot I skipped over or skimmed, but I think that I've managed to collect a lot of information here, and maybe these videos will inspire you whenever you're creating a character to do something interesting or wild with them, if your DM will let you get away with it. There's a lot of untapped potential in Paladins, from the Roman-era guardians of the Emperor's Palace, to scholars fascinated in study and research based off the Scholae Palatinae, and even other aspects of the 12 Peers, whose devotion to their Emperor is paramount. I feel like there's a lot of directions that Paladins can go that they don't necessarily get to sometimes, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video. And I think that's really cool, and I greatly encourage players to go out and branch out with the class, because I know a lot of people consider it stale, but it could go a lot of directions. But before any of you branch out, and before any of you go anywhere, none of you better steal my Oath of Vengeance cowboy idea.
You're welcome to try.
So, by the way, have you guys watched all the way to the end? Nice. I know these videos take a lot of time to watch, they take a lot of time to make too, but I'm hoping to do something shorter for the next one, and if you enjoyed what I did here, maybe give me a like and a subscribe. I'm not going to complain about my engagement metrics going up. Hit me up in the comments with what you'd like to see too. I already have an idea of what I'm doing next, but I'm always interested to see what people are interested in. And until my next video, keep an eye out, and good rolling.